let me just say here, Kip Twitchell, Tom Hall, it's October 1st, 2020. Tom has shared with me his paper, and I want to get the name of that correct, Tom, right? Accounting Logic Map that he's written in 2020. I've asked him to consider ways of explaining. It's a complex paper. It's a very there's a lot to it. So I've asked him to come up with some simple diagrams that help me make it more approachable. We've started just in the last couple of minutes and talked about this diagram for just a minute. I'll summarize here real quick, Tom, and then we'll just bring people up to speed. Tom was acting as an accountant in a kind of a bookkeeping firm, was my sense, and he would have customers come in, and he was trying to figure out how to make the financial system smarter, so that it did more rather than so much being left upon him.
I mean, basically, we're looking at trying to understand entities through their data and looking at the accounting model and how accounting can help us understand that, the kinds of things that we want to understand about a particular entity, the kinds of questions we could ask, and the answers we should be able to get back from the data that captured about that entity. Is that right?
Exactly. Yeah, a lot of this kind of thing, I think, is necessary for just setting up a logic system that is auditable and that is kind of, to some extent, a base for, future developments.
Yep.
And I'm not saying like the system that I'm proposing here is, the one true system or anything like that. Obviously, people have their own ways of doing things, but I'm just trying to find a general way to approach it.
Yeah, it's a framework that you need, a sort of framework if you're going to apply AI in some way to the accounting systems. This is a way of approaching that sort of problem, it seems to me.
Right. But I do think that more data is like usually pretty helpful in what we want, just insofar as the data has good quality.
Yes.
Which that's like that was the whole goal that I was trying to achieve ultimately with these ideas is what is quality data? Am I looking at something that had been verified? And why can't we just make that process a little bit faster and more secure and so forth? But I think these other ideas kind of came out of it a little bit, where if you have this set of data that already exists in some database or some set of databases, there are ways to efficiently attach what you need into one kind of blob, and from that infer various things that you wouldn't have been able to do otherwise. And this is something that is not really that novel, because humans do this stuff every day. I guess like the only novel thing here is I'm trying to place it in a context that's logically concrete, such that something other than a human could understand it and do it ahead of time.
Well, I like where you're going, and this is useful to me. So, but build upon this. Give me more on the. I understand I understand from my own experience the point on the generate step of this, right? The generate report, to do the pullback. And you're right, we do this all the time, but that doesn't mean what you're talking about here isn't it isn't a new concept. I haven't really thought a lot about estimate significance, right? But it is an important part of the reporting process. But what do you mean by that, estimate significance? Give me more to that, can you?
I can try. So, I mean, as an accountant, I was originally trained as an accountant and in finance, but on the accounting side of things, we were always taught, what's important. You can't care about all the transactions. Like, you really only have time for what's material. And it's true. I mean, it's not just an accounting concept. Effectively, you want to spend what little time that you have on the things that matter to you. So, this is something that would give you a little bit more insight into, what you're working with. And like, if you're forced into a particular situation where, you have to, spend time doing something, you want to just do it more quickly and, be a little bit more, forgive me, just quick with your with the systems that you're using. I mean,
So when you
significance, like it's a similar kind of thing. Significance, scope, materiality, trust maybe is a little bit something different where maybe there's more dimensions involved.
It could be though, but in terms of trust, if you were something, if the assessment of the agent was that this was a multinational corporation that had very substantial, and you get the result of your report comes back and says, they've done 2 transactions in a year, and it's represented to you that the data you have is complete, that's going to make you, well, that doesn't make me trust either the data or trust the agent who represented the data in that way, right?
Right. And I want to say I didn't do much in the way of, trust modeling in my paper, but I kind of do wish I had, just because it does seem a lot more important. Just
boy, that's a
from a materiality perspective as well.
Yeah, that's a fruitful place of thinking to me. I have some real trust. I've done a lot of thinking about trust. Trustworthiness is one of the greatest measures of efficiencies that you can have. 2 individuals, when you can measure and assess trust quickly, individuals that are trustworthy can have efficiencies that are never available to others. So it would be a very powerful concept to be able to measure that in some way.
So I want to say also that I guess all this stuff, and humans too, anyone can be wrong about something, right? So like, you only can assess based on, I would say, your prior experiences and, the thoughts that come to you and the data that comes to you in the present. So, this is just an attempt to kind of bring that all into one space and really identify those relations, because, we are caring about, how much do we have to care about this agent? Like, care, trust, these things involve not just the agent, but the relations that the agent has to, oneself and all the other agents that might be involved in that one-to-one relationship or indirectly.
Excellent. I've got a good sense of this. It's insightful. You've taught me. I haven't thought of this sort of framework, so I think that's useful to me.
So
just in terms of your nomenclature, capital E then is the data? Is that what you're defining that as?
So E is the informational image of the entity.
Okay.
So that is not, the entity, because what the entity is, I might have in the paper said like the entity, but I kind of meant, E. But technically, this E here is like what has surfaced
Yes.
in the documents.
Yep.
So it's not going to be complete. Like it's never going to be complete. There's no way, because if it was, then it would be the entity.
Yeah.
Right.
Well, it wouldn't necessarily be the entity, but it would be it would be voluminous for one thing. It would be like having a video recording of someone's entire life, along with, some way of automatically recording the thought processes if as a child, as they develop the ability to think, um, and a clear audio recording of everything that person has said. That's still not the person, but it would represent the a large aspect of what that person is, and consuming that, because of the time involved to build it, consumption typically, unless you find some way of going through it in a shortened way, it's going to consume as much time, take as much time to consume as it was to make, at which point it's not very efficient.
I mean, what's the point? Yeah.
Yeah.
So, I mean, I'm not trying to say with this whole process either that we should get to a point where we can completely reproduce, everything about the real entity. Again, it's just I'm trying to put in place some kind of framework or tools that, are clear and are efficient.
Let me
get some information about these things.
Another way of thinking about that on the other extreme from having video, like we're moving towards that sort of that ubiquitous set of information about us, whether it's retained for very long, we don't know, with all the in our society. But sometimes I do genealogical work, and
nice.
if you go back, if you go back before 1850s, you start to get lucky to find a census record of some sort about a person. And so the limited set of things is you try to get to a name, you hope to get to a birth date, and you might get to a place where, and then you start to get to marriage, you start to get to children, you start to get to death dates, death places. Those are the starting entity points for assessing an individual of some sort at the minimum level. Okay.
Yeah, definitely a similar kind of framework can be applied, I think.
Okay. And when it comes to accounting, though, we've had some level of structured data that represents acts of the individual in some way, that's quantified in some way, usually by a numeric amount, of quantity, or a dollar value that we've used to do these kinds of assessments.
Right.
Okay. So we just discussed here, he's starting, how much does this agent matter in relation to other agents? How much does this agent control that I need to care about? And G in his paper is the abbreviated mathematical formula or symbol he's used to represent a single agent. We've just discussed for a minute what he meant by agent. I suggested, so if you're thinking about businesses or partnerships, but if you think about it maybe as a legal entity, that's a made-up person before the law. And so you kind of, whether it's you're always thinking about a person, kind of, in that some people are real people, other people are made up people that control other things, and all of those things have certain aspects of them that that you want to understand as you're doing this kind of process. Is that a good summary, Tom?
That's pretty good. And I want to also point out that the G is referring to the agent's role in the system of financial feedback and flows, that it is a source, it is a generator of these flows by its actions. Not necessarily all of its actions, since not everything is about money, but a lot of the actions that it takes will result, especially if it's in the scope of business.
Let me go back. When I started recording here, you were saying you were trying to understand efficiently what you're trying to assess quickly something about G. The image that I had come to my mind was that when we meet someone physically for the first time, if the individual we meet happens to be, foot and a half to 2 feet tall, 3 feet tall, we know they're a child, and we are able to assess quickly what the capabilities, a lot about that person's capability, just because of the way we see them. When we see financial records, we don't necessarily know that, but you're trying to get that sort of insight quickly into what am I looking at, and assess what the agent characteristics are in an efficient way. Is that an okay analogy?
For sure. And I mean, this is just one way to look at it, because there's plenty of dimensions in finance. It could be as broad as reality, depending on what people like to pay for, or not like to, but have to pay for. So I guess this is a good piece to look at, though, because of its relevance,
Yes.
to people.
And the same thing for person, right? Different types of people, whether there's distinguishing features, male and female, their occupations, their status, all of those kinds of things. This is just one aspect of understanding agent. It's not the whole thing that makes them up. Okay.
Right. And I guess accounting in general, you're trying to see where does the control lie among all these various elements, and also within that, of course, what are the forms of that.
Okay.
That's kind of inherently tied to the concept of an agent having this control. So
Excellent. Very good.
So to do that, I mean, the normal way, I would say, you would want to pull a report from a database for something like that. And that's a good way to do things, for sure. But a lot of times that's costly too, because you have when you're pulling it, you need to define the specific things that are important. You need to define the methods of pulling things, and what all is involved in the scope. But wouldn't it be nice, right, if you could have the query kind of run itself to determine that scope? Like, why should we limit ourselves to trying to define the logic ahead of time, when a lot of the logic already exists in the form of the recorded data?
Let me restate that. I don't know that I'll make it. I understand what I'm going to say back to you. I think you'll understand it. A novice may not understand this, but a mentor of mine, Rick Roth, there is, in the late 90s, early 2000s, there was all this trend towards having a high level, chart of accounts, a simple chart of accounts for organizations, right? To keep it. He said, well, the thinnest chart of account is that you have a chart of account that is, your financial statements would be composed of a single row, and the balance of it would always be zero. I mean, if you take and collapse collapse everything in accounting down to the simplest thing, you end up with a single row, and because all the debits and credits should be equal, it should always be zero. Well,
that would be nice.
but that's not very informative,
Right.
right? And that's the part of the problem with historical accounting is that the chart of account is like the index of a book. It has to be predefined before you start to capture the data to decide what you're going to be able to report upon. And so, reading an index of a book is not nearly as interesting as reading the book itself, and defining up front what the book is going to be about from the index of the book is going to limit what you write in the book. And so generating a report is that same sort of thing. It's how smart were you to ask a question of the data in order to get the report. Whereas to think that question you've asked of the data will, give you many different dimensions. You'll be smart enough if you're just starting to do the investigation. The first question that you ask is not going to give you some interest, but it's not going to give you a full sense of things. Is that an okay summary?
I think so. Yeah, it's definitely like not an easy concept to talk about, so I appreciate that.
Okay.
Let's see, I'm not actually sure which diagram I should pick next. I think this one is not complete, so, well, let's look at it. I guess it's just a question. So there are too many dimensions to process, how to make it more efficient.
I love the question. This is a perfect slide for me.
I did like your talks about what's the optimal strategy of getting that financial information into place. So sorry, I think I cut you off.
No, so Tom, since I could talk about this for hours, so I won't do that. I'd love for you on this video to explain to me what did you perceive from my discussions about this? What does this mean? Why did you ask this question? And what does it mean? So people understand kind of what you meant by the question.
Sure. Well, I mean, so I say there are too many dimensions to process, and I guess I should have started with this diagram because it's kind of speaks to that. Okay. So like I mentioned, this diagramming tool isn't the best, so everything is kind of centered, so it might seem a little weird. I can only align within this,
Yes, okay, that's fine.
Anyways, it's maybe a familiar picture, I'm not sure, but
actually, Tom, I want you to go back to the simple diagram for just a minute. Well, you don't have to change diagrams. But
okay.
talk about the issue of aggregation summarization, just so people that are coming into this conversation understand what that point means. Can you do that?
Sure. So when you have a giant amount of data that's, there's just so many problems that can arise with, the management of that, from storage to, access to all sorts of things. Like how do you approach, accessing that data? Like what queries do you have to use? You have to keep caring about all those smaller relationships. As time progresses, maybe they don't matter as much. And so, you'd want to only look at things in an aggregate way where you have like a block of something, and you can say like this block is this set of things that I care about in relation to this other large set of things that I care about, is easier than going through each and every one of those things and then recounting them every time. From a calculation perspective, that's definitely costly as well. So
yeah, so good. So the image that you've just generated here, right? The analogy that comes to my mind is, let's suppose somebody's presented me with a set of data, and
Sure.
I think to ask the question, what is the current, held assets or net position of this agent? Are they are they a net debtor, or do they have a net set of assets, right? So I
Right.
ask that question. Now, the thing that I don't think to ask, because the data is more robust than that, is I don't ask, does this entity, how many felonies has this entity been convicted of, right?
Right.
Now, if I don't think to ask that question, that question would be probably more insightful to me about the type of entity I'm speaking with than is going to be their net asset position.
That's true. Yeah.
Yeah, but coming back to, again, the aggregation, see, when it comes back and it says if there's 50 transactions, going through and looking at each transaction is not nearly as insightful as getting a single answer back that says there's 50 felonies. That 50 next to felony, boy, that's an efficient way of assessing something, isn't it? Right?
Impressive.
Yeah, 50 would be, I don't know if that would be possible to do, but that process of all of that transactional data, when you get to a quantification of that, a balance, an aggregation in some sense, it really highlights the status of a person in their position. Interesting. Okay.
Yeah, thank you. I appreciate the small interludes. It's good. I would say this is my kind of, it's not the full picture by any means, but it is a pretty comprehensive picture. Obviously, there's a lot of elements on the screen right now.
Okay.
And some are overlapping each other. The reason for that is because the ones in the darker gray, I'm considering those to be part of the exterior entity, which is a concept of something that I think comes naturally to humans, where we understand that this thing exists in reality, but is totally foreign to a machine because they're just interpreting a bunch of ones and zeros. So they would have to be more told explicitly that this thing outside of the dimension that they perceive exists. Maybe I shouldn't have started there.
No. That's okay. It's okay. Let me restate what I've heard, because you're trying to find ways of explaining this. We're going to make multiple passes through this, Tom. Okay? Because there's multiple. You've been thinking about this a long time, and there's going to be multiple ways that you come to understand that you've represented here. But let me just restate what you just said there and see if I understand it correctly. Right? So on A, I can see A, it's all set of all accounts, and the smaller, in the white, A accounts. When it comes to all of the possible things that could be known about me, the number of things that are recorded is much fewer. And typically it gets to some level of structured data when you get to some level of things. When we have machines understand it, we're doing better with natural language processing.
Absolutely.
Still, whether you do natural language processing or not, machines tend to get to some level of structure. And when they get to some level of structure, it becomes mechanical when you have some level of structure. So even if it's natural language processing, there's typically some level of structurization that goes on to do that. So the white is the things that are perceivable in a more structured way by a machine in some way. Is that an okay summary?
Yeah, exactly. I appreciate your summary there. That's exactly right. I mean, these white elements here are effectively, I couldn't really fit everything on here, so they're most of E, that informational image of the entity.
So there's a drill down of E.
Right, right. And I mean, that's, all we can hope to do effectively, or should really want to do. I mean,
Yeah.
who cares, about every little thing that happens? You shouldn't, but uh, you should care about the potential for things to happen uh, based on, what you see in reality. So I
Yes.
guess that's kind of where I was going with this, is like, um, this whole system is happening, and it's being recorded, um, and it's observable. So why not use it for, you know, a better, like, why not use it to kind of check the quality of itself, and at the same time uh, get a little bit of extra knowledge or inference, from what already exists. Because especially when you look at transactions, I know there's some who, you know, say that transactions are a view of, the actual data that we should be looking at, and I think it's true. Um, it's definitely not uh, the only thing we should care about, but it's something that I think is helpful to examine, because um, it is a discrete and observable join between all these different elements, and it does provide a structure that you can source these inferences from. So
Yeah. Okay.
um, I do think it's something that shouldn't necessarily be thrown away. I mean, if we were to throw away, the concept of a double entry transaction, we would need to, represent these relations in some other way. So you can have any structure you want. It's true. Um, I think there's something to be said for the efficiency of, comparability with double entry transactions. But it is true that it is lossy, because you have to, you know, record things historically, and you have to, um, you know, basically fit everything into this box, which it won't necessarily always fit into.
Well, you've covered some ground there. Why don't you? Can you? So I want to go through that more, but maybe can you take me through the entities you have here first, and give me.
Right, of course. Yeah, I'm sorry.
No, it's good.
So we started with an agent, and those are things that exist in basically the right side of the screen. As I mentioned, this software wasn't the best, so it was kind of hard to fit it in here. But you can see that there's large ellipses on the right side. There's revenue activity generating agents, expense activity generating agents, and they're overlapping, because it's possible for that to be a single agent. In a lot of cases, the software I was working with in the past, had such things as like a separate kind of definition for that. Like, you can only be one thing, you can only be a customer, or you can only be a supplier. And so, that can basically make it more challenging to um, accurately record the entity
Well,
or
so
that agent.
yep. So it would be similar to only being able to classify an individual by one attribute of that individual, right?
Yeah, yeah. I mean, it's pretty sad. Um, yeah, everyone is different for sure, and we would want to, um, you know, do as good a job at describing someone, accurately as we can.
Yes, they're multi-dimensionality. So you have basically you've the common terms we use in business record keeping are customers, vendors, and you've got two categorizations I see of owners, in a sense, owners and employees. Is that
right? I also, could have added other things, right? Like there's authorizers is the name I gave them, but it's basically just government agencies
okay?
in most cases, which are indirectly providing, or not providing, rather, taking some control of the entity.
And I would,
at various
so
points.
just so you say, I would probably be inclined to classify them in a certain sense of owners, because in a certain sense, they often represent in democracies, but not even in democracies only, they represent society as a whole, right? That's their role, is to represent what will we allow to happen in our society.
Sure. Yeah. I mean, for sure that's definitely a political debate, I guess. But I see where you're coming from there for sure. I guess since they do, take that control at times, they will. I'd say that's the most apt place to put them, as in the same box, at least as owners.
Okay.
And then, of course, as time progresses, there's these activities that are happening, these control exchanges in the exterior entity, and hopefully, if we're trying to keep financial records, the records will exist for one, and they'll be easily accessible, for two. And a lot of times these days, we have, like you mentioned, a lot less friction in how things are done. So, records are still being produced, but we're not necessarily following, checking up on everything. At some point, at my old positions, I've been asked to do reconciliations. I think it's still valuable to some extent. But that's, one good candidate, I think, for automation, essentially.
Can you, but drill down on that a bit for me. When you talk about reconciliations, what do you mean? Is it one? So the way I define reconciliation is it's an agreement of two different record keeping processes. If, for example, in the olden days when people would reconcile their checkbooks, I would keep a paper record that was my ledger, my running bank account,
Right.
and I would have the bank would send me a statement. If I had no transactions in the ensuing period, if the two balances matched, then I knew that my records were the same as their records. Is there something different that you mean by reconciliation, or?
Yeah, so I guess, so I also care about balance. However, I think my definition of balance is a little bit different than yours. Pardon me. Because to me, a little bit more complete of a reconciliation process would be to reconcile on both sides of, inflows and outflows.
Yes, pardon me. That I imply that, but I did not state it.
Okay.
So you're being more specific than I was, but you're right. Because
I only say that because
a net deposit on one side with a corresponding check would not mean, oh well, wait a minute, there's something that happened there, right?
I mean, it is also important just to look at, the end balance, of course.
But let me restate there, because to be honest with you, the reconciliation isn't just what you just highlighted there. The reconciliation isn't just between the end balances, because to be honest with you, balances are a different form of record keeping from the transactions themselves.
Right.
And so reconciliation, if the reconciliation of the transactions to the balances don't agree, then you've got a reconciliation problem And that's only in one set of books, right?
Right. Yeah. Yeah. So I guess the struggle there is like they have to be accessible and accessible in such a way that the system can handle that data and process it. Obviously, there's plenty of people working as accountants every day these days, and they get these data streams from outside sources, and they can be valid, and they usually are. They're usually pretty reliable, but integrations can be faulty, and like a huge struggle that I had in trying to validate different financial records in my career has been just is this integration working, first of all. Is it when it's working, is it actually serving the right transactions, and so forth? Is the dates matching up? So there's more, I think, reconciliations than just statement to statement.
Yep.
And I think those kinds of reconciliations can happen, can be run. Like, it doesn't have to be a reconciliation where we're proving something on a standard basis. Like, you could run it on demand, right? Tell the program, like, do these dates match up with what I'm expecting? If not, then obviously maybe there's something wrong there. So it's possible that there isn't, but it's nice to be able to do something like that.
So you have, but help me on the diagram here. You have data streams and integration, S and Z, at the top and bottom of this diagram.
Right. So, it was kind of a dimensionality thing where, I only have two dimensions to work with here. I guess I'm trying to show that as a step before something becomes a transaction is it has to be generated, by one of these agents.
Okay.
And then go through this process of becoming a document.
But you weren't trying to represent in some way, well, is that, were you trying to represent, though, a cause of the reconciliation in the aspect of having two of those, or is it simply that you had to, the diagramming software you're using didn't allow you to have all of the customers, vendors, owners, employees, authorizers going into a single
Yeah,
instance?
I think there is some truth to putting the data streams and integrations as part of the exterior entity. It is kind of wishy-washy a little bit, but it's more like, so those are like actions being taken in reality that are fleeting, where sometimes you have an audit trail for that kind of stuff, but if that's the case and you can go back and look at it, then it kind of just becomes a document, right?
Yeah.
So I guess that was kind of my thought process there. That makes sense.
No, it's good. I mean, you're generating, I don't know if I'm going to take you a little bit off course from what you were trying to describe in your paper, but I want to go back to the reconciliation point for just a moment.
Sure.
I've worked in my career, right, I didn't know that I was working on it until blockchain came along and somebody described it as a shared ledger. I've been working on shared ledgers, but not with external parties. I've been working on shared ledgers internally. Rick Roth told me one time, he was one of my mentors about this, and even my, Eric Dena and other, that Rick said that years ago, he recognized that in corporations, we build multiple record-keeping systems that basically have the same functions, they do the same things. If you look at the underlying technologies, the processes that are automated, but they do them against different versions of the transactions.
Right.
So a major one is the difference between external financial reporting and internal management accounting.
Right.
Both of those systems are fed, by and large, the same set of transactional data and record from transactions to balances to get to positions that people can understand quickly. And by doing just those two, you have multiple levels of reconciliation, because you have to have from the operational system that actually generated the transactions. Those transactions are duplicated into those two data supply chains, I call them. Then those transactions are posted into balances. So you're now reconciling three things. Plus, you have to try to, why does management accounting not equal financial reporting? What's the difference? So there's I mean, you've got multiple levels of reconciliation going on there. Okay. But the point I guess I was making about my experience was trying to get to an internal shared ledger. If you lowered the level, increased the level of detail that you maintained in one ledger such that it could serve multiple purposes, you eliminate the reconciliation.
Right. Yeah, I think that's definitely valuable to do. I mean, this is just the scope of a single entity here, is what I was thinking of it as. But like, why not? If they want to enter into the agreement to gain that like time-saving benefit, why not extend this to
external parties, shared external parties, right?
Right. I mean, there's no reason really why you wouldn't, unless you don't trust the other person. So
yeah. So the point is that, like, one individual commenting on one of my blog posts said, "So Kip, you're saying reconciliation is a non-value add activity?" Reconciliation, I said, automating reconciliation, fully automating reconciliation is very difficult, because any breakage, it's difficult for the machine to detect what the breakage was. But increasing the level of detail so that we can manage in our reporting processes such that we eliminate reconciliation. So reconciliation can be eliminated even if it can't be fully automated.
Right. Yeah. It's definitely a really cool way to think about it too, which I hadn't considered before meeting you. So I appreciate it. And I guess one thing I should say is, like, the end goal of this being maybe a more balanced type form of product, where maybe that's not the right thing to say. Maybe more inference type form, just with the machine taking over, some part of the drudgery, essentially.
But the thing,
I don't think it'll be possible for it to tie all those reconciliations together necessarily. But I think it would be helpful to have something that alerts to the presence of a possible breakage, rather than necessarily just going and trying to fix it itself. Ultimately, it'll probably happen, but
let me just, the thing that you've triggered here, that this discussion has allowed me to think about in a more simple way, perhaps. We started with the discussion of, if you had a videotape of someone's life from the time of their birth and all of the transaction, right, all their history, the processing of that in the form that it sits today will take as long as the person has lived.
Right.
And that's the compute capacity to do that, whether the computer is our processing of watching it, or a computer actually analyzing that data is very expensive.
Right.
So when we get to that point of trying to assess something less than the full picture and measuring that, it's where machines become, we have to help the machine, we have to design the machine to find ways of doing that effectively.
Yeah, definitely like pre-trained models, I think, are, a really good way to kind of get around that, because, the data is like has its own kind of inherent value and shows the relationships that can exist. I guess we're probably running out of time pretty soon here, but like,
oh, you're right. We should
I
be
think
for today.
yeah. So I think like what a tool like this that I'm trying to describe would provide is maybe just a more logical way for the machine to ultimately report what it's doing and why it's making certain decisions, in terms of like categorization or reconciliation, if it gets that far. I'm certain that at some point in the near future we will have systems doing this kind of thing, and we want to be sure that they're doing it correctly. So you can't necessarily just go up and talk to it and ask it like, why did you categorize this way? You want to be able to assess the train of thought that brought it to that decision. Sometimes things are clear, right? It's like, oh yeah, this is a very obvious categorization, because it's always been categorized that way, right? Like, why wouldn't you do that? But
okay, so we'll
I'm looking forward to it.
Yeah, we'll continue next week then.